So, is Foxhole dead? Now obviously the answer to this question depends on when you are watching this video. Somewhere in the future, long after this video was first published, Foxhole will undoubtedly have died. Possibly because of the heat death of the universe or because the servers were taken offline. But for now, the short answer is no. And the long answer can be summed up quite nicely by slightly altering a poem by contemporary Scottish philosopher and poet Walter Buchan. We're all soldiers and we don't care. We're boot boys who die our share. Soldier jackets, army boots, run about every night. Foxhole's not dead, I know. Foxhole's not dead, I know. Foxhole's not dead, I know. Foxhole's not dead. Oh no, it's not. To dive further into this, let's have a look at some data to get a clearer picture. During War 103, every day at around 10 o'clock GMT, I took a sample of the amount of players in-game via the Foxhole Stats homepage. That results in the following data points. From these data, we can simply calculate the average player count by summing the player numbers and dividing them by the amount of days that the war took place over. This leads to an average amount of players that were online at 10 o'clock GMT of 1,056. Using the average player count of 1,056 players as our measuring stick, we see that the player count during the war is front-heavy. Only during the first 9 days do we have a player count that is above average. After that, it is only on the 2 weekends that the player count exceeds the average, leading to the preliminary but pretty obvious conclusion that over the course of a war, less and less people log in to play. Now, before we grab our shovels and start digging a foxhole-shaped hole, let's have a look at some more data. Using Steam charts, we can grab the daily peak player numbers for the last 3 wars: War 101, War 102, and War 103. The 101st war lasted 16 days including resistance phase and had a peak player count of 4,553 that occurred on the first day. If we use the daily peak player count as our measuring stick, we can see that only in the first weekend do we get another peak at 65% of the player count on the first day. For the rest of the war, the daily peak player count hovers between 60 and 50% of the initial peak and drops to 35% of the initial peak on the last day. Now, if we average the daily peak player numbers and take that average, 2,570, as our measuring stick, we see that only during the first week and on the second weekend does the peak player number go above the average peak player number. War 102 saw the release of update of 1.52 and lasted a total of 38 days including resistance phase. It saw a peak player count on the first day at 5,270 players, which is about 16% higher peak than the previous war. Using the peak player count from the first day as our measuring stick again, we can see that player retention, though better, drops down the longer the war lasts, and sees little resurgences around every weekend. Averaging the daily peak player numbers just like we did with War 101, we see the same image emerging. During the first 3 weeks of the war, the daily peak player number only goes below average on 2 days. Whereas the last 2 weeks of the war, we have a below average peak player count every day. War 103 lasted 30 days including resistance phase and had a daily peak player count of 4,357 on the first day, which is 5% less than War 101 and 17% less than the update war that was War 102. Using the daily peak player count once more, we see the same thing as in Wars 101 and 102, a downward trend as the war progresses and little peaks in the weekend. Using the average peak player count again, we see the same picture as the previous wars as well. In this case, however, it's only the first half of the war where the peak player count is above average and the entire last half of the war, except for some reason Saturday the 13th of May, is below average. What these data heavily suggest is that every war all players start off very enthusiastically and over the course of the war the interest and enthusiasm dies down significantly. If we think about this a bit harder, we might realize that this, though true, is a bit more nuanced. Since the start of a war is a unique happening, a lot of people make a point of being there at a specific time, war start. So they all log in to witness and participate in it, leading to a significantly higher peak player count on the first day of a war. Whereas during the rest of the war, there's not really a globally appealing reason for all players to log in at a specific time at a specific day. Then, besides the initial peak, we do see a clearly downward trend the longer a war goes on for. Now people will ask me, Frerk, that's all well and good, but that only pertains to the course of wars. What about longer time frames or the entire lifespan of Foxhole? Is it not so that less and less people are playing the game over time? Is it not so that updates act as a defibrillator for the game? Is it not so that there is not a high enough influx of noobs to compensate for the leaving vets and keep the game alive? Well, let's have a look at the available data. Using the data that Steam Charge provides, we indeed get the picture of a game that occasionally gets revived with an update, but starts to bleed players soon after the update. It is here that we see the big red scary numbers that seem to indicate that the game is doing badly. Sure, there are these massive player spikes in August of 2020, March of 2021, and September and October of 2022, but these have to do with massive updates. In August 2020, there was update 36 that saw a massive overhaul of the vehicle system and some big logistics changes. In March 2021, there was update 42 that saw the introduction of the weather system and artillery changes. And in September and October of 2022 is the massive player spike that came with the release of 1.0, the Inferno update. In November and December, after the honeymoon phase for all the new players wears off, we see a massive drop again. So surely all of this is indicating that we should break out the old trumpet and play the last post for Foxhole. Well, not really. If we care to dig a bit deeper into the numbers, another picture emerges. Taking a closer look at the big red scary numbers first, we must realize that the negative difference is the difference between the indicated month and the previous month only. So when there is a high amount of players in October and an average amount of players in November, that still results in a big negative red number. Using the average player count from Steam Charge in each month, we can calculate an average player count for the previous 12 months. So, for instance, if we look at July 2022, we can calculate an average player count by summing up the average player count of July 2022 and the previous 11 months. This will give us a total of 19,914. And if we divide that by 12, the amount of months we used for the calculation, we get an average player count over the past 12 months in July of 2022 of 1,659 players. Now we continue this for the entire dataset to get a good and fairly balanced idea of the average player count over time. Plotting these results into a nice graph gives us a good view of how the game's player numbers are trending. After the initial peak that came when the game first released as early access to Steam, the average player numbers go down and level out between August 2018 and February 2021. From there on, there is a steady climb for over a year and then a small dip in the months preceding the launch of 1.0 in September of 2022. After the release of 1.0 in September of 2022, the data seems to suggest that the average player numbers seem to level out again. To answer the question whether or not Foxhole is dead or dying, we turn our attention to a Mark Twain misquote. The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. Making videos like this one is fun and frustrating, but it also consumes a lot of time and effort. So if you want to see more of these types of videos, let me know in the comments. And if you want to support my work, there are several ways of doing that. You can become a channel member or buy me a coffee at Ko-Fi. Link in the description.